Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of the Underground. We are a free, pluralistic, and transnational university and charity founded in 2017 in the basement of a nightclub. I am Naum, the head of program of I Want to Believe, an investigation into religion and belief systems. As part of this 3-month practice-based residency, we are unraveling belief systems in relationship with politics, economics, nation states, and society. I would like to welcome our researchers and our visiting participants, who I kindly ask for a donation to support this program and future programs as well. Today, we're going to have a talk of 40 minutes, followed by 15 minutes Q&A. So if you have a question, remember to drop it in the chat. And I'm going to introduce our lecturer today, who you already know. He was with us in our symposium on day number 1. And he's Bishop Bryan D Ouellette. Bryan is a semi-retired by ritual autocephalous Eastern Orthodox Western Catholic bishop and exorcist for the Old Roman Catholic Sacred Order of Saint Michael the Archangel, Order of Exorcists. Also currently offering private instruction in Gedo Zen, meditation, mysticism, prayer, and Christian esotericism. So, Bryan, I cannot express how excited I am about your talk today. So the stage is yours, and take us to this journey, please.
Well, thank you so much. I do appreciate that. And this talk today, I'm calling the psychology of exorcism. And it should give you sort of a continuation of what was talked about at the symposium, about archetypes being the building blocks of reality. And certainly this might seem a little bit esoteric to some, because again, I tend to use a semantics that's based on a model that combines metaphysics with the more empirical sciences like physics, as well as psychology, which has worked for many decades now to become a respected science within the medical field. And I think to a certain extent, it's now accepted as that. The APA, for example, the American Psychiatric Association, is sort of a standard in academia today, where, much of how we view psychology comes from very empirical research and the study of behavior, using scientific method, and all of the things that are associated with good science. Unfortunately, though, psychology is, by its very nature, very incorporeal. We're dealing with the aspects of the mind and how the mind works, as well as how this relates to behavior and standards of behavior. Because when you look at what psychology really is attempting to do, outside of just making observations about behavior, it's also trying to, at least from a medical standpoint, heal what we refer to as mental illness. The problem is mental illness is really a value judgment. We can base it on things like how a person's able to function, whether or not they are feeling well enough to be able to perform the necessary tasks that survival requires. But at the same time, there are other aspects that are less clear. For example, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, 3rd edition, had homosexuality listed as a mental illness. It was actually referred to as, I believe, one of the paraphilias, if I'm not mistaken. And now from the DSM-4 on, it was removed because society had shifted, and the values of society and the way we make those value judgments has changed. And that's part of how we progress as a civilization, to grow in awareness and develop new ideas about how we look at old things. Certainly when you go back to biblical times, as we talked about in my first lecture, homosexuality was something that was punishable by death in ancient Jewish culture. And now we would look at that from modern sensibilities and say that's horrible. How could anyone have ever thought that way? But again, it comes back to how we view what is considered to be healthy functional behavior, and then to kind of come up with, to the best of our ability, something empirical, something tangible that gives us a framework or a model to work within to decide what is going to be illness and what's going to be a variation of normal behavior. The APA also got into trouble several years ago. I'm not sure where they stand today because I don't follow it as closely as I used to. Before I became a clergy, I was working in a clinical capacity. So I was very much involved in the world of psychology before I moved into ministry. And certainly my experiences as a clinician had shaped why I became a clergy. And I'll talk about that if I have time. But ultimately, what it really breaks down to, when we're hearing these things about behavior and what is healthy and what is not healthy, it always comes back down to the value judgments of society. Now, the APA got into trouble a few years back when it referred to or was considering debating whether or not pedophilia, which is another paraphilia, another listed as an illness currently, if that was not just another variation of normal human behavior. And then it started to discuss whether all the paraphilias, if homosexuality is a paraphilia and that's accepted, where do we draw the line as to where this paraphilia, this paraphilia over that paraphilia is considered to be okay or healthy or illness? We don't know. Because it's basically based entirely upon society's value judgment. So, in homosexuality, we make values and say, well, as long as they're two consenting adults, who cares what they do? But when you look at pedophilia and children involved where they can't consent, then that creates a different dynamic, and society makes a judgment on that. And the reason I bring this up is because this is how we as clergy must assess what we're dealing with when somebody comes to us with a spiritual crisis. And so I'm going to be talking about how these very tangible aspects of psychology, dealing with very intangible observations, relates entirely and completely to the work that I do as an exorcist, and how, again, it comes down to value judgment, and how ultimately it's not as empirical as we would like it to be. And I don't think psychology can ever go that direction. But first, let's review what we talked about in the first lecture. And hopefully all of you watched it. If you didn't, I would highly suggest you do, so that some of what I'm about to say here makes sense in context. But the word psyche itself, where we get the word psychology, in the ancient Greek, it meant literally animating spirit. It was a spiritual word. And that was because the ancients did not see a difference between what was spirituality and what was the world of the mind. Same exact reality as far as they were concerned. It was only in modern times where we started to make a distinction there. And because of taking the word psyche and using it for our word psychology, that we would then start to apply it to the empirical sciences and remove it or divorce it from its origins as ultimately a field of study that is very much spiritual. We also see them as two separate things. We see the world of the mind as being, something that is very much a medical reality, neurology, for example, even neuropsychology being a field where you combine both the neurological aspects, the physiological aspects of the workings of the mind with the incorporeal aspects of psychology and human behavior, the study of human behavior. These two things obviously are being combined, but the spiritual component completely removed. And that is because largely science has a bias against, I think, spirituality. Scientists that talk about spirituality are not as respected as those who avoid the subject altogether or condemn the subject. as being superstitious or no longer relative or relevant, rather, to our modern society, and that we need to look at things in more progressive, with more progressive eyes. And I think, exorcism has fallen completely into this category, and it has become a victim of this mentality, because largely one of the biggest criticisms I see as an exorcist is this idea that we are actually doing a disservice to these clients. The pervading opinion by such individuals is that all people that we would say are demonically possessed are essentially mentally ill, perhaps suffering from some type of acute psychosis. Maybe it's a variation of schizophrenia, or any other kind of illness that could have psychotic features like bipolar disorder, or even schizoaffective disorder. There's a large number. I mean, even in the non-psychotic disorders that also have features that people might equate to psychosis, like even dissociative identity disorder, formerly referred to as, basically a fractured personality, multiple personality disorders. I think what they used to call it, or what, a lot of people still refer to it as in more vernacular terms. But dissociative identity disorder is a very interesting word, because much of what we see in clients that believe themselves to be demonically possessed exhibit almost identically the same features as a dissociative personality. Maybe not to the extent of what we would see in multiple personalities, but there's something very similar about that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here, because the relationship between the two is very blurred. And because of the various biases that exist in religion and science, the unfortunate result is that clients are not being well served, because it's always going to be all or nothing from whichever side of the spectrum you happen to fall on. So when you go to a doctor, be a psychiatrist or a therapist or something that, someone who would be working with these types of illnesses, they're always going to be taking an only scientific approach towards this. This is a mental disorder. This is schizophrenia. This is something that, has to be treated with medication. Be it Haldol, Clozaril, all these drugs, antipsychotics that we use to treat these types of conditions, but completely ignoring anything that might be spiritual going on. Again, because there's now a disconnect between how the ancients saw the mind and how we view the mind today, in far more empirical terms, and thinking of spirituality as largely superstition or some kind of delusion for some, or at the very least, imagination. Not really understanding that perhaps this non-corporeal or incorporeal world that we refer to as the spiritual world, at least in more religious or spiritual terms, might be just as real, if not more so, than the one that we equate to empirical reality, the external world, or the world of the five senses. The ancients wouldn't have made that distinction, and I don't think neither shall we. And certainly as an exorcist, I have found it very useful to not make that distinction. So when you go to, again, getting back to what I was saying before I went off on that tangent, when you go to a psychiatrist, and you have these features that might be relatable to a demonic oppression or possession, then essentially what happens here is you're going to come out with a medication. You might even be referred to a facility and held against your will for a while. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities depending upon the philosophy of the particular agency that is treating you. But when it comes to the church, they take the complete opposite viewpoint, which is just as dangerous, and that is this idea that, or not so much in the Roman Catholic Church, because we work very much with doctors. In the Catholic Church, in the Roman Catholic Church, in the even in the Orthodox Church, to some degree, not as much though. We work with medical professionals, but in some of the more modern churches, charismatic churches, where there's a lot of the laying on of hands and focus on the more spectacular aspects of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes, people will come in thinking they have they have depression, and then they're told by their pastor that it's a demon that's attached to them, and the demon has to be removed, and then that becomes a very superstitious type of almost pseudoscience. That's not helpful to them either. So you got science on one end completely removing the spiritual, and then you got the church on one end, at least some parts of the church, making it almost entirely a religious thing. And it's always going to be a combination of the two, because again, when you look at the word psyche and how the ancients saw it, they were one and the same thing. The behavior that comes out of our minds was a spiritual reality, and it could not be divorced from it. So all non-corporeal aspects of our nature, including thoughts and feelings, as well as the archetypes that are built into our DNA, were all part of this spiritual world, just as much as they would be seen today as parts of human behavior, and really basically just symbols of human behavior. But they're more than just symbols. And as an exorcist, I've been able to see this and work with it and utilize it and create a model for it that has been very effective at healing people that do suffer from what I call spiritual crisis. So yes, I do, as a Catholic, refer to a demonic possession as a demonic possession. We have various categories. There's demonic obsession, demonic oppression, and demonic possession are the primary ones. There's also subcategories like demonic infestation, demonic interference, and these are, other types of things that we might see in the work. But that's always used as language for the model. Under the underlying theme, and that's because most people are not familiar with how the actual system works, it's easier to communicate to them in ways that are easier for them to understand. And so by using terms like demonic possession, most people know what that means, and they know it's serious, severe, and requires certain interventions in order to resolve. But the problem is, science on its own cannot resolve this. This is obvious because we actually get a lot of referrals from psychologists, not so much psychiatrists. Medical doctors are not as willing to talk with us or refer clients to us, but a lot of psychologists do. And that's when they are doing their assessments and realizing that there are certain features to some of these clients that are suffering from what initially looks like a mental disorder that has all of the classic signs and symptoms of a spiritual crisis, which might include either a demonic obsession, oppression, or possession. So as we break this down and run tests, essentially is what we do, to make assessments and to diagnose, very much in the same way that a medical practitioner would, we are then able to ascertain an origin and work to resolve it based upon that, based upon the results of that assessment. And that's what I do most of the time. And almost always, it never results in exorcism. So as an exorcist, I actually don't perform a whole lot of exorcisms, relatively speaking. Most of the time, what we are doing is making assessments and getting people the help that they need. And in only those situations where conventional help is not effective, do we then come in with the tools of the church and use those various tools to help them and heal them. And in those cases, with a very willing client, it always works. It always works. And that's because of how the mind works and how there is no difference between the spiritual world and the world of the mind. They are one and the same thing. Okay. Archetypes are basically the spirits that rule that world. And when we understand that archetypes are more than just symbols for various themes that run through human psychology, when we understand that these things are sentient in and of themselves, we can better understand the root of what we call possession. And not all possession is demonic. And that's a very important distinction. I can give you two examples that can help you to understand that possession is essentially either a willful or non-volitional dissociation. So let's look at some examples. Obviously, you know, demonic possession. You know, you've seen the movies, and they're always, of course, a bit dramatic, and they exaggerate the truth, but at the same time, they're not entirely off. Like if you saw Anthony Hopkins in The Rite, or if you saw the original Exorcist, I mean, yes, heads don't typically spin around. You don't necessarily get the projectile pea soup vomit that, you know, ends up all over the priest's face. There is always vomit, though. I mean, that is something that happens. It's just usually a clear mucus that comes up, that they spit out, but not, you know, so they exaggerate it for dramatic effect to make it more Hollywood and more interesting for you as an audience to watch. But there's truth there. So that's, you know, obviously what demonic possession in the most extreme forms would look like. However, there's other types of possession. Let's look at voodoo, for example. Okay, a lot of people refer to it as voodoo. Voodoo is actually the practice. Voodoo is the religion. All right, and in Haitian voodoo, there is ritual possession, where the practitioners volitionally enter into dialogue with the Loa, who are spirits, usually ancestors of the dead, and they allow themselves to be possessed by the Loa so that they can have a divine experience. It's a part of the ritual. It's part of the religion. And it's all done volitionally. And there are some remarkable things that happen during these episodes. There's been some researchers that went out to Haiti to actually explore voodoo, because it is a little bit mysterious to us, particularly in the West, seeing some of these more, I guess, tribal systems of religion that are less conventional. And they came back with remarkable reports. One that stands out in my memory was a researcher was, you know, watching one of these voodoo rituals and saw a 10 or 11-year-old child go up, and the Loa that were being conjured at this particular event entered into his body, and he was able to take a bottle of high-proof rum, drink the entire bottle of rum, which would, in practical medical physiological terms, should kill the child, because that would kill an adult. I mean, alcohol poisoning would be a very likely possibility if you drank an entire bottle of rum in one shot. This child literally just drank the whole bottle of rum, and it was confirmed to be rum. It wasn't like some trick. It wasn't like water in a rum bottle. It was rum. The researcher confirmed it. He drank the entire bottle and did not exhibit any deleterious effects. After the Loa left him and he returned to normal consciousness, he wasn't drunk, he wasn't sick, he required no medical attention. And how can science, how can empiricism explain that? They'd have to say it's a trick of some kind. It's got to be some kind of illusion, kind of like, you know, David Copperfield, or some kind of like magic trick that you know, the researcher missed. That's how they would try to write it off. But you know, when you look at demonic possession, you see remarkable things too. Like levitation is rare, but it happens. Speaking in languages that they never studied happens. Speaking in old languages that are mostly dead, like Aramaic or Latin, or Old Greek, these happen. Okay, Sumerian, we hear it. And these aren't academics. A lot of these people, you know, grow up in rural areas where lucky if they have a high school diploma, and they're speaking fluently these ancient dead languages. How does that happen? Empirically, how would you explain that? But under this effect of possession, these remarkable things occur. We can even see it, and I can give you a third example, which is method acting. We see it with actors. I work with some actors. I think I mentioned last time, you know, I consulted for the most recent Conjuring film that's about to be released, Conjuring 3. If you like horror movies, if you know the Conjuring series, then, you know, it's probably one of the best modern horror films out there right now, and I'm very proud to have been a part of it. But working with actors that work with dark archetypes, like you would see in a horror movie, it's very important for them to understand that even in the seemingly benign context of acting, these archetypes can possess them. And typically what we would say as the audience and look and say, that's an amazing actor, that's a brilliant actor. When you're completely convinced that the actor has become the character, where you even forget that the actor is the one playing it and you just see the character. We see that with some great actors. Anthony Hopkins is definitely one of them, I think. There's so many, we could list them off. That's possession. And that's the reason that they're able to connect so perfectly, is because the archetypes start to take over. And they have their own sentience, and they have their own abilities, which go beyond what we would understand to be normal physical science, that cannot be explained through scientific method. These are where the God experiences come from, that people have, mystical experiences or direct experiences with God that mystics have talked about. And if you haven't had one of those experiences, you might be skeptical. You might think that it's some kind of imaginary or superstitious effect, but it's not. And, in those rare times where you can catch it, you can actually use scientific method to, at the very least, say, I can't explain how this happened. And so when we are looking at a demonically possessed individual, what we are trying to ascertain is which particular malevolent archetype has seized control of this individual's normal consciousness, and what method, meaning what archetypal process, can we deploy in order to remove it and bring that person back to normal consciousness. Now, with an actor, typically the method that's required is simply to go back to, come out of character. Some method actors don't. Some method actors will stay in character the entire time they're filming the movie. What's his name? I can't remember his name now. Joaquin Phoenix, I think is his name. He's one of those individuals where he'll stay in character the entire time he's filming. He'll go on interviews on late night television, or, I think it was on David Letterman once, when David Letterman was on the air, and he was still in character, and people thought that he was having a psychological break, but it was because he let the archetypes take over for that period of time so he could perform the role. And then when the role's done, they come out of it. But that's because volitionally, when you initiate such a possession, you have a certain amount of control over how it happens. Same with Voodoo. All right, Voodoo, there's an agreement. When a person agrees for the Loa, which you might say is another type of archetypal system, takes over the consciousness, there's an agreement that it ends at the end of the ritual, and it always does. And the participants come back to normal consciousness. But with demonic possession, and the reason why this gets everybody's radars, all the red flags going off, is because there's a malevolent side to it. It's non-volitional. It's almost like a type of spiritual rape. And the victims typically have no control over it. That's where the priest comes in as the archetype to correct the condition. And exorcism is the archetypal ritual system, the symbolic language that the archetypes, the malevolent archetypes that took over that person's consciousness, that victim's consciousness, what can remove it? Because the rules of the archetypes always follow the archetypal system in which they are found. So for Christian demonic possession, which follows, of course, the archetypal system of Judeo-Christian theology, where you have things like angels and demons being primary forces, angels representing archetypal good, demons representing archetypal evil, and demonic possession being controlled by archetypal evil, would require an archetypal symbolic system or a symbolic language to communicate to that archetypal evil that it no longer has any authority here and it must be removed. And that's how it works. Clauseril's not going to do that. Haldol's not going to do that. Antipsychotics are not going to do that. Okay? Not when you're talking about that dissociation where the person's consciousness is completely lost to the infiltrating archetypal sentience. That's the difference. Okay, so ultimately, we don't need to worry too much about whether or not this is a mental illness in the conventional sense, or this is some kind of spiritual illness that can't be described in medical science, because ultimately what you want to do is work holistically with the entire person's reality, which means we must care for their body, we must care for their mind and emotions, and we must care for their soul, all at the same time. Unfortunately, all these systems are set up to only do one. So, the church only deals with the soul. The doctor only deals with the body. The psychologist only deals with the mind. When in reality, an exorcist, to be effective, needs to be all three of those things. Not necessarily that you need to have a medical degree, but you have to be mindful of the physiological effects and knowing when a person can be better served by physiological cures rather than something that would be more of a spiritual cure, like exorcism or the sacrament of the sick, unction, the laying on of hands, any kind of healing rituals that the church would deploy, solemn blessings, simple blessings, all of these things that can be very effective depending upon the type of intrusion that's occurring in the psyche of the victim. And so that's how it breaks down, and that's what the work really is. And so I would always caution people to, when you have the bias that says it's all mental illness, to understand that, does it really matter if it's effective? I alluded to this earlier. I'm going to mention it now because I do have a little bit of time to talk about it. When I worked in clinical psychology, when I worked in lockdown facilities where the police would bring people in who were mentally unstable, and they were creating a disturbance, and they were arrested, but rather than take them to jail, they took them to us for a psyche evaluation. Most of these individuals were psychotic. And I was finding that all that would happen is they'd come in, the psychiatrist rather, would spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes with them and prescribe them an antipsychotic and then move on to the next one. And that was the constant thing. And my job was there to make sure that they kept taking their medication. And the medication was not making them better. The medication was not healing them. The medication was not even helping them. But what it did do is made them so desensitized to their behavior that it made them easier for the rest of society to deal with them, so that they weren't committing crimes or they weren't going out there disturbing people. They were just too apathetic to do anything. They just sat there staring at the wall, basically catatonic after getting on Haldol. Eventually, Haldol, if you don't know much about it, is a very dangerous drug. It can lead to an awful condition called tardive dyskinesia, where you lose control of your facial muscles. Your tongue hangs out like a dog, and it's very difficult to reverse. In fact, in many cases, it's permanent. That's what it constitutes good psychiatry today. I mean, really, I could not justify that as a person of conscience. And I always felt, having a relationship with God and having a relationship with spirituality, being a religious person, I felt that that there was something to be said for spiritual healing. And so I explored that, and I got into that, and eventually, as a priest, having to deploy that and seeing the power of things like the sacrament of the sick, watching some of the remarkable things when you go to a person who's dying, and administering last rites, the amazing things that happen in those moments that no one gets to see except for the priest and maybe the few family members that might be there. I have seen people numerous times be completely unconscious in basically what is, for all intents and purposes, a coma, dying, and coming in, and part of the rite of extreme unction, we call it. It's the last rites, the final rites of the church, where you give usually confession if they're conscious. You give Eucharist, and then you anoint them with oil for the last time, the oil of the sick. And if a person's not conscious, they obviously can't make a confession or receive communion. But you try to put a little particle of the Eucharist on their tongue, even if they are mostly unconscious or completely unconscious. It just dissolves anyway. But I have been always shocked that there will be times where I've had a client who is completely, dying within hours of imminent death, has been unconscious for days or weeks. And then I come to the point where they're getting ready to receive communion, and I'm getting ready to put that particle on their tongue, and all of a sudden their eyes open, they sit up, they open their mouth, their tongue comes out to receive the Eucharist, and then they go back down into unconsciousness and die moments later. I have seen that several times. There is power to these things, and there is a remarkable aspect that the mind relates to. Again, it's archetypal, but not to be confused or say that just because we're referring to it as an archetypal thing, that it's not genuine spirituality, because they are the same thing. Always understand the word psyche in context to how the ancients saw it. There was no separation between mind and spirit, and nor has there ever been. We created that distinction because we tried to create a secular reality and made empiricism the rule of law in science. It shouldn't be. It should always look at the entire dynamic. But this is how it works. And, I wanted this to be in 40 minutes. It's hard to give a real formal lecture on such a complex subject, but hopefully I've touched on it and given you some framework to understand it a little better, that we're not just going around from house to house performing exorcisms on everybody. We're actually doing very concrete, very serious assessments. We work with psychologists, we work with medical doctors when they're willing to work with us. And we always refer out to a psychologist or psychiatrist if we feel that they can be better served through that convention, and most of the time they can be. In the more extreme situations, that's when the church gets involved, and we then go back to the more ancient rites of exorcism that were performed in antiquity. And when those cases come to us, exorcism is the effective cure. And I have watched people that have been sick, have been on psychotropic medications for decades, and they've come to us and they've received an exorcism, and their life goes back completely to normal. All this medication for years could not help them. All this psychotherapy could not help them. The rite of exorcism did. How can science explain that? Well, that's because the way the archetypes work. And hopefully that, I don't know if that was too too much of a wild tangent, but hopefully it gives you a survey of my work and how we really operate as exorcists.
Yeah. I think it is both. Like, it's really clear, but we are full of questions.
Yes.
So let's start. Chloe, be the first one.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask about, so from what I understood, these archetypes are kind of built culturally, although they kind of all mean the same thing. And in the last talk, you said that Harry Potter was no different from the Bible in a way. They mean the same thing, they're just different. They're the same archetype, just different kind of cultures around them. And I wanted to ask, for example, in an exorcism, if there is an evil archetype possessing someone, how does the kind of evil archetype recognize what you are doing against it, if it's kind of what you are doing is cultural, and in another culture they would do another thing, another kind of good model against it? Obviously this kind of evil archetype is recognizing the culture, if you understand what I mean. I kind of have a question about that.
Yeah, I think I understand where you're getting at, and the way it is that these archetypes are so pervasive, and they transcend culture. While they're built out of culture for the way we recognize them, they actually transcend culture on every possible level. So, one of the things that might surprise a lot of you is that a lot of our cases, believe it or not, are people seeking help from Arab cultures. Saudi Arabia is a big country where we get a lot of requests for help. And you would think, isn't it strange that a country that's largely Muslim would be coming to a Christian exorcist for assistance? But in Islamic culture, and kind of predates Islam too, there's these things that they call the jinn. They're kind of like evil spirits, not really demons in the same sense that Christians or Jews would refer to demons, but more of like an evil spirit kind of thing. And we've had actually people that grew up in those cultures, Saudi Arabia, come to us who are now living here and believe that they were possessed by a jinn when they were out there, and needed our help to remove the jinn from them. And so, Islam actually has its own method of dealing with this. Judaism has its own method of dealing with this. In Judaism, there's the evil spirit, like the Dybbuk, A Dybbuk is sort of a Jewish version of this same kind of evil spirit that can possess an individual. And in Jewish exorcism, it's more about negotiation. It's more about trying to negotiate the spirit out or convince them or coerce them out of affecting the victim. Whereas in exorcism, it's more like commanding under the power of Christ to remove them. And even though culturally, from our standpoint, it looks very different, the methodology might be different, the archetypes are speaking the same language at a much more transcendent level. So they will recognize exorcism in the Christian context in much the same way they would recognize it in an Islamic context. Now, there are situations where we have seen that using the culturally specific model might be more efficient, because I think some of it has to do with how the victim perceives the rite as well. Not that the power is coming entirely from the person's belief in the rite, but also that it has some kind of effect where there is sympathy there with the cultural variations that exist. But I can tell you that using the rite of the Roman Catholic rite of exorcism would be very effective against a jinn as well. I've seen it, I've used it, and it has worked. Maybe not as effectively as if they had gone to an Islamic exorcist to use exclusively Islamic rules, but it still works because the archetypes are communicating at that transcendent level where all of these things are, the distinctions kind of break down. So again, getting back to the Harry Potter and the Bible, well, in the Bible we have Satan, and in Harry Potter we have Voldemort. It's still the dark archetype. It's the same archetype essentially, just different name, different characterization, different portrayal, different connection, different method, same exact archetype. So it would be completely possible for a person to become possessed by Voldemort, and you could see that. And there might be a case where you are doing exorcism, and in exorcism, in the rite of exorcism, we will actually ask, we'll demand, we'll command that the demon reveals itself. Give me your name. It's even part of the rite. And they might say Voldemort. That could happen. It would be rare, because I think it would be, I don't think Harry Potter's been in mass consciousness for long enough for that to occur. But there are times where you'll say, give me your name, demon, and it says lust, or it says, I've even had a demon say pedophilia. It called itself pedophilia. And I thought, well, that's kind of a bizarre name. No one has ever heard of a demon that refers to itself by that. But it's because as an evil archetype, hurting children in the sexual way, for example, is a very evil thing for a person to do. And it's gone on for thousands of years. It's not something new. It's not a modern problem. It's always been a problem. That it's become an archetype. It's become an evil archetype that can actually invade a person's consciousness. And then they become that thing. And then they start to behave according to that thing, which can lead to, of course, criminal behavior. So that's kind of how it works. I don't know if that completely answers your question. I hope it does. But yeah, it's pervasive.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there is a related question. So just gonna jump the queue and let Sonny ask. Sonny, okay, I can read.
Hi. Oh, sorry, I was unmuting myself. So my question was, can one culture's evil archetypes be another's good? Like, for example, in Buddhism, there are wrathful deities who are like basically archetypes in that culture, but they look like it could be demonic to a Judeo-Christian eye, I guess.
Oh, that's a great question, and it's something I have actually dealt with because I had a Christian missionary that I did not see eye to eye with. She was not Catholic, but she had done a lot of Christian missionary work in Asia, and particularly in China. And she said that during some of her work out there, she saw demons, and they were moving in and out of people. And it really disturbed her, and she never wanted to go back. And she actually canceled her mission and never wanted to return. And I said, well, tell me more about what you saw and what did these demons look like? And they were absolutely, completely wrathful Buddhas. The absolute, completely right down to every specific detail of a wrathful Buddha. And as we know in Buddhism, wrathful Buddhas, while they might be frightening and terrifying to the ego, they're very helpful to spiritual enlightenment and being able to transcend our limitations of the ego. And yes, Christians would be scared to death of those things, while a Buddhist might, who is at least developed, might realize this is helpful. I think there, in the Bardo Thodol, you have these wrathful Buddhas that actually consume you because they were trying to remove the illusions that could result in multiple additional lifetimes of suffering. Yes, these are the same archetypes, believe it or not. And certainly even in Christianity, you can see hints of this, even though Christians in the ego gets in the way from people understanding it. But think of it from this vantage point, okay? In Judeo-Christian theology, we have original sin. You had the snake in the Garden of Eden who tempts Adam and Eve to disobey God, which results in bringing death into the world, okay? The ultimate sin, we typically equate that snake to being Satan, who tempted them. That's, evil incarnate. And yet, in respect to this, if Adam and Eve in the theology had never fallen, we would have never been able to enter into an intimate relationship with Jesus Christ, which allows us to now enter into a state of salvation that Adam and Eve would never have known. Yes, they might have been perfect, but they were perfectly blissful. They would just be in a constant state of illusion and have no freedom of will, because they would be literally good just because they were programmed to be good. They weren't good because they chose it, and they weren't good because they absolutely were able to triumph over the limitations of failure. So Satan helped them to do that, didn't he? Look at Judas. They demonized Judas. He kills himself. The Bible says that he was possessed by a demon. But at the same time, if Judas had not betrayed Christ, the sacrifice of the cross could not have occurred, and Jesus could have never conquered death, and thus allowed us the path to doing that for ourselves as Christians. I think that's a wrathful Buddha. Honestly, it's the same. It's just a different story. It's a different way of telling it. And Christians like to demonize a lot of other cultures, so they really get into that whole thing. They've been doing that for the last 2,000 years, and we've seen that with missionary work all throughout. I mean, look at the Spanish Inquisition, for goodness sake. Every culture that wasn't their perfect ideal was demonized. Anybody that had a different belief system demonized. We still see that today. Evangelical Christianity is always guilty of that. It's horrible. Hopefully the Roman Catholic Church and Orthodox churches have moved on from that largely, but it still happens. So yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same archetype, but it will play out differently. And if you're hostile towards a hostile archetype or something that's maybe a little bit more programmed malevolently, it will respond in kind too. So, a Buddhist rather might be able to deal with a wrathful Buddha a lot better than a Christian could deal with a demon, even though they might be the same archetype.
So the apple is actually wisdom then?
I think so. The Gnostics were right. Yeah, the Gnostics were right.
Okay, Kayla. Kayla? I can, okay, maybe she's gone for now. So Ruth.
Maybe somebody else can go first. I'm still kind of forming my questions.
Okay, then that would be Tutti Frutti.
Yes. My question is, do you think that in order to be possessed, or maybe the archetype is the thing that is triggering a certain mental or spiritual condition? If you don't have that archetype, maybe you would be, let's say, in a better position. You know what I mean? I mean, I'm having a bit of trouble articulating the question.
I think I understand what you're saying, and I'll answer it to the best of my ability. Let me know if I'm not clear or if I'm not hitting your question correctly. But all the archetypes, all the primary fundamental archetypes, like the shadow and the trickster, are the two that we would be dealing with the most in demonic possession, are built within our DNA. We all have it. Everyone has this, and that's ultimately where the dark side of our nature comes from, because it is there. That fallen nature that we would refer to in Judeo-Christian theology is essentially the trickster and the shadow archetypes in our DNA that come out from time to time, that we suppress, that Freud would say is the superego that controls those impulses from the id. And the id would be far more connected to these darker proclivities than what the superego will allow. And of course, the superego is a construct to control those impulses, because we certainly can't be living in civilized society by those impulses. And if we were, I mean, we'd be creating all sorts of havoc. And some people do. We call them criminals. You know, we call them severely mentally ill. We call them sociopaths. Those are people that live by these dark archetypes. They have no there's no super conscious that can actually take over and control it. But the super ego is essentially the fail-safe to protect us from those things. But they're all built within our DNA. So what happens in demonic possession, from what I can see, is that for whatever reason, usually because somebody has connected too closely to a particular perceived sinful behavior, let's say, for example, fornication. All right. If they grew up a good Christian, if they've been trying to live a good Christian life, but then fall to what would be seen in Judeo-Christian theology as the temptation to fornicate, you know, having sexual relationship outside of marriage, or maybe prostitution or some other kind of sexual deviancy that they might see as evil, then that could unlock the vibratory rate within their DNA that is connected to that shadow or trickster archetype. And then if they connect or identify too closely with that behavior, then the archetype takes over. And that's where the possession comes from. So essentially what exorcism is infusing within that person's consciousness a more powerful, benevolent archetype. So in Christian terms, we're putting Christ in place of that shadow archetype. And Christ is, of course, a super variation of the hero archetype. And as well as a combination of many others, including, you know, the wise old man, as well as the hero, kind of a super archetype of all the benevolent ones combined into one. Even the eternal child is very much part of the archetype of Jesus Christ. And so what we are doing is we're replacing that shadow trickster archetype with one that can supersede it. Basically, we are building externally a super ego to help control that person's id impulses, to use psychoanalytic semantics. Does that answer the question? I hope.
Yeah. I mean, yes. Probably you could go on forever, but yeah.
Oh yes. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. There is a question. I will ask it, since I'm putting together different ideas in the chat. Do you think that technology or AI or robots can be possessed?
I think we can program the behaviors of possession into those things, but no, I've never seen technology as a vehicle of transmission, other than the fact that what affects us can affect can be transmitted across various lines. So for example, people ask me, a very common question is, because I've been on television and I've been on Ghost Adventures, which is a show where they investigate demonic locations. And there are a lot of people that are fans of that show will ask me, is it safe to watch the show? Could I become demonically possessed watching Ghost Adventures? And my answer to them is, well, are you afraid that you will? And they said, yes. And I said, well, then you shouldn't watch it. It's the fear response that creates the potential for possession. But if you understand that this is a show, there's nothing that the show can do to you unless you let it affect you, then you won't be affected. It's only people that have a fear where they surrender their volition to something that they see as higher than themselves, where there's risk. That's what the archetypes are trying to do. So what I teach my students is how to control the archetypes instead of letting the archetypes control them. Most of us go through life completely unconscious. Most of us are at the best, we're subconscious. You know, we're mildly aware of what we're doing. Most of our activities are completely on automatic, and we're ruled by our thoughts, feelings, biases, and paradigms. We're not really making decisions. If we're a liberal person, then we typically will behave and fulfill the liberal archetype because we feel compelled to, not because it's a choice, but because it's what we identify with, and we become that very thing. But we shouldn't be. We should be able to identify objectively where there are liberal philosophies that are useful, where there are conservative philosophies that are useful, and when to apply each, and being able to control each one each and every time. That's a true healthy person who can do that. And when you notice people that are like this, they don't really fall victim to biases, and they are objective people, and they're able to walk the tightrope between the various extremes of society and behavior. And that, in my opinion, is the epitome of both mental and spiritual health. So yeah, I don't think technology though is I don't, they couldn't be possessed in the true sense, only in ways that people could perceive, where they create the condition internally and they think they project it out externally on the device as being the cause.
Yeah. All right. And let's squeeze in maybe the last question. Jessica?
Can you say more about the physicality of possession? Like you mentioned earlier, the salivation, and are there other common physical manifestations?
Oh yeah. Well, in the most extreme, we will see things like levitation. It's not all the way to the ceiling, like you saw in the movie The Exorcist, but you will be able to observe, we've been able to observe levitation of several inches above the bed, and it only happens for a short period of time. Speaking in unknown languages, having inhuman strength is a big one. I've seen a 12-year-old girl be able to literally knock down 4 fully grown men who are holding her down. And we're talking 4 men who are, over 210 pounds, holding her down. And she was able to, with one swoop of her arm, knock them all down. These are some of the physical conditions, and this is where we get into some of that mystical aspect, where the incorporeal or non-corporeal world bleeds into the physical one, and the physical rules break down. This is where we need to really combine what religion is seeing and what quantum mechanics and theoretical physics are able to now start to observe, because I think that's where it comes from. I think there's some fundamental level there where the laws of physics are only work at a certain level. And we know once you get down to those subatomic levels, they don't apply anymore. And I think a lot of this, what we equate to the spiritual world, is coming from that quantum realm.
Okay, fantastic. Bryan, there are many questions, and time is short. So I wonder how can the participants reach you if they have any questions related to their particular projects and research?
Well, the best way is probably just to go to the church's website for my ministry, which is esotericcatholic.org. That's esotericcatholic.org. Make sure you put org. It's not .com. .com won't get you there. You'll find a plethora of content where you can get all sorts of information about what I do and what we do, as well as ways to contact me, including the Nicolaitan social media network. We have our own social media network that's separate from Twitter, Facebook, because we want to do our own thing. So you can join us there. You don't have to be a member of the church to be there. It doesn't cost anything. And we have a lot of discussions like this, and a lot of different ideologies that contribute. It's true diversity. And I'm all about diversity. I'm all about respecting individual thought.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic, Bryan. So thank you so much for being twice in our program. Personally, I always find this conversation very enlightening and revealing. So yeah, I appreciate it. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Anytime. If you ever want me to come back for anything else, just let me know.
Maybe we will. Maybe we will.
Awesome. Thank you.
Fantastic.